right, these notes go in the HBS course file. So a review of biometrics. We talked about biometrics in PBS. Biometrics is a field of science that uses a person's unique characteristics to determine identity. Biometrics is a field of science that uses a person's unique characteristics to determine identity. So some examples are facial features. There are facial recognition programs, computer programs that are out there and are already being used to identify people. Retinal patterns. So the retina of your eye can be used to scan and identify you. Behavioral characteristics. So your voice patterns, how you talk, the tone of your voice. Your handwriting can be used to identify you. Gait is your stride, how you walk. And of course, fingerprints. Biometrics can involve qualitative data or quantitative data. So we need to define those terms. Qualitative data, observations of qualities or characteristics, things that are not measured or counted. Qualitative data are observations of qualities or characteristics that are not measured or counted. Quantitative data involves measurements, amounts. They are observations with a numerical value. Quantitative data involves measurements and amounts. They are observations with a numerical value. Forensic anthropology is a unit where we're using biometrics to help discover the identity of skeletal remains. All right, so here's a picture of my femur. So sketches, and we're going to have lots of really sciencey words, so we'll go over some of those terms and how to pronounce them. So if this is the femur, here's the bump on the top, here's the bump on the side right here. So this is the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. Trochanter is spelled Trochanter. Greater trochanter, lesser trochanter. All right, some other important terms. Malleolus. Nuchal. Ramus. And so when I put this line like this, and these are all my own pronunciation keys. This is just what I put on here so that I know how to pronounce these terms. So you might want to use the actual dictionary pronunciation guide. When I use a line like this, that tells me meatus. So it's kind of all together. Meatus. Nasion. Trochlea. Epicondylar. Prognathism. So another diagram of the femur. On the femur, the rounded, smooth parts, those are the condyles. And that's where this part of the bone articulates with another bone. So articulate means they're coming together and interacting. So condyles, this is where the femur articulates with another bone. All right, so these prominences right here. This says tubercle. Now, just on the other page, I called them the greater and lesser trochanter. Here, I'm calling them tubercles. So tubercle is kind of like a general term for these bumps. So tubercle is a bump or projection that connects muscle and tendons and ligaments. So it connects muscle, tendon, ligaments to the bone. So tubercle is a bump or projection that connects muscle, tendons, and ligaments. When the tubercle is on the femur, that's when it's called a trochanter. So the greater trochanter is a tubercle, lesser trochanter is a tubercle. Trochanters are tubercles on the femur. Okay, so the bottom part of my HBS comp book on this page, I've labeled forensic anthropology because all of this is going to deal with forensic anthropology and how we can use specific bones to find things like gender, age, height. So for gender, the pelvis, the skull, and the long bones are the ideal bones to help us determine the gender of skeletal remains. For the pelvis, the forensic anthropologist will look at the shape of the cavity. For the pelvis, it's the shape of the cavity. For the skull, it's the shape of the eye orbit. The eye orbit shape. Is it more rounded? Is it more rectangular? Also, on the skull, they'll look at the frontal bone. And on the back of the skull, they'll look at the external occipital protuberance. So occipital bone is the bone on the back of the head, external on the outside. So on the skull, they'll look at the external occipital protuberance. And if that's present or not, that will give them an idea about gender. And then finally, the long bones. So femur, tibia, fibula, humerus, those long bones, the length of those long bones will give you an idea of gender. Generally speaking, the longer long bones are males, shorter long bones are female, but we do have tall women and short men, so it's not a hard and fast rule, it's just a generality. For race, the skull and the femur are helpful to find race. On the skull, forensic anthropologists will look at the nasal guttering, the nasal spine, and the nasal index. Nasal guttering, nasal spine, nasal index. The femur, they will look at the curvature of the femur. To determine the height of skeletal remains of the person whose the skeletal remains belong to, we'll look at the length of the long bones. And there are actually formulas that you can use to determine height from the length of certain long bones. And then finally, for age, forensic anthropologists will look at the pelvis to see, is there an epiphyseal union? Is there still cartilage present? So epiphyseal union, cartilage present. You can also look at the long bones, the femur, the tibia, the humerus, to look at those bones, look at the development of the trochanters and condyles. Is there an epiphyseal union, or is there still a growth plate? So look at the femur, tibia, and humerus. Look at the development of the trochanters and the condyles. Is there an epiphyseal union, or is there a growth plate present?